I got to tell you a little bit about Derrick before he comes up here, because he probably, I realize we got senators and congressmen and whatnot coming up here, but he's probably got one of the most impressive resumes. He worked for Phil Gramm on one of Phil Gramm's campaigns. Saint Phil Gramm, who's still alive. I worked for the guy in Georgia when he ran for president. What could have been? He was an assistant to Vice President Cheney when he was in the vice president. He then left and became the chief of staff to Ed Follner at the Heritage Foundation for a number of years, and then went and worked for one of my good friends, Ben Sasse, as his chief of staff. And I think he got tired of all the lame dad jokes from Ben Sasse, and he left. And now he works for the American Fuel and Petroleum Manufacturers. And I'm excited to have him come, particularly because of yesterday's news, which I didn't know was coming when I asked him. So Derrick Morgan, come on up.
Good to see you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, don't sit on the clicker. All right, so let's get straight to this. The fuel standards are changing, because you and I have you've had several email exchanges with me where there is a real bias against large families when you're forced to get 200 miles to the gallon in your Prius so you can't fit all your kids and your dog in the car.
Isn't that right? And it may seem like an esoteric issue potentially, but it's a huge tax. It's a huge tax on cars, especially on families that want more utility, more size, more horsepower. And so actually the move this week is going to be the biggest deregulatory move of the Trump administration, most likely. We're talking about $500 billion. Yeah.
Wow.
And so when you're looking at the Trump presidency so far, we've got to say, from a conservative standpoint, the judges are looking really good. Tax cut bill was a success, and the regulatory agenda has been good also, and this is the biggest one of those.
Yeah, I got to say that I knew that being on Team Republican, there would be some regulatory rollbacks, but this actually is impressive, and this particular initiative is pretty impressive overall.
It is, and I think a lot of credit has to go to Elaine Chao and Jeff Rosen at the Department of Transportation, and also EPA is involved in the rulemaking too, under Acting Administrator Wheeler, and they were the ones that put out the rule this week. And so what it does is it looks like from their initial analysis that it will save about 1,000 lives a year, because there'll be safer cars on the road, and there'll be people, and it'll save about $2,000 off the price of a car. And that's important for a couple of reasons. It's good because then people can buy the kind of car that they want with the kind of features that they want, but it also helps with fleet turnover so that people are able to afford new cars that have the latest safety features. And so for that reason, it looks like it's going to save about 1,000 lives a year, according to their analysis.
Yeah, being a Christian, I understand God said take care of the world. I'm totally down. I recycle. But some of the zealotry now, and largely against petroleum manufacturers. My dad worked for an oil company. Growing up, lived in Dubai. Plastic, so much of what we have in the world it's not just gas in your car. And yet there seems to be a whole lot of people out to get you guys.
Oh, well, that's the truth, yeah. And I started working in this industry about a year ago. I'm from Texas, so it's good to be back home.
What part of Texas?
From near the Dallas area.
All right.
Yeah, and so it's great to be back home. And I'm really proud to work in the industry because it's 3 million or so people that work in and around our industry, a lot of them here in Texas, but all over the country who make products that we use every day. So I'm proud of that work. I also love the fact that it's a free market organization. So let me just give you one little snippet. So this spoke a lot to me as I was looking to leave the Hill and go to a trade association. A couple years ago, you might have remembered there was a ban on exporting crude oil that was a relic from the 1970s, right, when we had a real scarcity of that resource. And our organization and some of our companies actually kind of benefited from that because we are the refiners. So if the crude oil couldn't be exported out of the country, it had to be refined in the United States. In a short-term way, it was kind of good for our companies. But our organization said, no, we're for free markets in energy, and that includes crude oil exports. So to me, that spoke volumes that it was a long-term look kind of an organization. And I think the same thing is true with the car standards. People should be free to buy the kind of cars that work for them. They shouldn't be second-guessed by Washington or, even worse, Sacramento. And that's a piece that we should mention too, because that's a really big deal about this rule, is that the administration is taking away California's ability to set its own fuel economy standards, which is completely appropriate. And some of you may remember back to the dark days of the early part of the Obama administration, And the administration sat down and gave California its own ability to do this, and then sat down with the auto companies who were going through some trouble back then, as you might remember. And that's when they came up with these really high CAFE or fuel economy numbers, was back in 2009. And so what this is doing is undoing all of that and restoring choice and affordability to the American consumer.
You know, you mentioned choice, and it always strikes me as the Democratic Party defines itself as the pro-choice party, and yet it doesn't really want to give you any choices other than that one thing. And it comes to fuel economy standards that I have a wife, 2 children, God bless my family, they're not light packers, and we now have a dog, and I had to upgrade my smaller SUV to a large-sized SUV, and if you want to get a car that gets 50 miles to the gallon, go for it, but mine gets, I think, 18 on a good day, but it packs my entire family without my wife fighting with me.
That's right, and you should be able to make that decision. And as it was under the Obama standards, the cost for that car was going to go up and up and up, and is essentially subsidizing EVs in California. And we know the typical EV buyer makes 6 figures or higher. So here you have American families all throughout the country who are paying artificially high prices for their vehicles so we can subsidize rich Californians driving fancy EVs.
Speaking of subsidies on those cars, I mean, when you and I fill up our car at the gas tank, we pay a fuel tax that then part of it is a federal transportation tax. And if you plug in your car at night and you're not buying that, you're essentially, there's another subsidy for you driving on roads you're not really paying for.
That's exactly right. In some places too, you don't have to pay tolls. You can get on HOV lanes and so forth. So there's lots of different subsidies like that. But you're exactly right. The gas tax is supposed to be a user fee, right? So we're using the roads. So when we fill up, we pay a little extra so they can help to keep the roads in repair and build new roads and so forth. Bracket here that sometimes it's used for bike paths and beautification and other things, you know, which not a good use of taxpayer money. But you're right, EVs go scot-free in a lot of places. Now, in some places, they're starting to undo that in a lot of states. So I know Oklahoma just passed a provision where when you register your car, if it's an EV, you pay a little more to make up for the fact that you're not paying the fuel taxes to try to help with the roads. And that's a step in the right direction to try to, you know, even the playing field. And I should say, totally free market, our organization is too. We welcome competition. And if people want to buy EVs, you know, go for it, like you said. But it should be a free market decision.
Not to head down potentially awkward territory for you,
Sure.
but I saw this amazing graph. Bloomberg actually did a really cool article the other day where they essentially cubed up the entire nation in little squares, every square representing 1 million acres, and then plotted out the amount of land that is used for various things. And I was shocked to see that more agricultural land in the country is now used to grow corn for ethanol than to grow corn to eat.
Wow, yeah, the number we've used for a long time was 40% of the corn crop going to ethanol. So it might have increased recently. And yeah, that's another interference in the free market. It's the renewable fuel standard, which again was developed, I think, with good intentions of trying to make us more energy independent. But this was all done before the shale revolution. That's what's making us energy secure. Our entrepreneurs, our innovators, a lot of them here in Texas, a lot of the oil being pumped out the Permian Basin, that's what's making us energy secure. We're now the #1 oil producer in the world. 10 years ago, we were the #1 importer of refined fuels. Now we're the #1 exporter of refined fuels. Yeah. And that means a lot of good jobs. That means a lot of good jobs, and it's good jobs for everybody from highly trained chemical engineers down to people working, you know, on the platforms out in the Permian Basin or in the Gulf. So, that's what's making us energy secure. It hasn't been any government fine-tuning of any policies.
Well, you know, we've had Google and Facebook up here today, and a lot of conversations about automation and whatnot, and it seems like the American petroleum industry out there is actually one of the areas that is benefiting to some degree by people redirecting into and getting jobs in the industry as it grows, as they're outsourced elsewhere to robots.
Yes, well, it's going to be needed in our industry because our industry, like a lot of them, has an aging workforce. And we go to campuses all the time and tell students that you're able to get a really good job in our industry. And there's this perception that somehow we're an industry of the past and we're not going to be around. Well, I can assure you we're going to be around for a long time, not only in the fuel space, but also in petrochemicals, like you mentioned. And that's, the basic building blocks there, and so many things that we use every day, from, cell phones to plastics.
I got to stop you right there, because I distinctly remember when I was in grade school in Dubai, our environmental science teacher specifically told us that by the year 2000 there would be no oil left. So how is this?
I guess I should pack up. Yeah, that's right. We think we know these things, right? But I'm reminded of Julian Simon's wager on, way back in the 1960s, when there's everything was talk about peak oil and peak copper and peak this and peak that. We have human ingenuity. We're able to find more, use more. The fracking revolution, I think, shows that more than anything. And so, I think as long as there's human ingenuity, we're going to have a successful fuel future.
I had to laugh this morning. Governor Abbott was here talking about a Texas city that decided to ban fracking, and the state legislature had to undo it.
Was it currently named Austin, or was it somewhere else?
Yeah, it was actually somewhere else, believe it or not, up north of Dallas somewhere. It is striking to me that, I remember being a kid and when the covers of all the magazines, when global warming became all the rage with Time and when Newsweek was still around and whatnot, and that we were going to be out of oil, and yet this American ingenuity, we keep finding new oil that we weren't supposed to find.
We sure do. It's been absolutely amazing, what's happening in West Texas. I think Texas is now third in the world if it were its own country in oil production, which is just amazing. It makes my heart proud as a Texan. And that's a lot of hard work from a lot of people that have made that happen, and ingenuity. And so I think the contrast is extreme, right? You've got fuel economy and scarcity, and we've got to make things more expensive to try to manipulate behavior, right? We do that on cafe, and then the RFS is a similar mindset of we've got scarcity and we've got to kind of push another product into the market and so forth, instead of just trusting the market to come up with the products. That's a very different mindset.
You keep mentioning free markets and subsidies, and I'm always, I'm a proponent of any and all energy sources.
Yes.
But it certainly seems like there are a lot of energy sources out there that really are way more subsidized than they want you to believe, petroleum not being one of them. Yeah. I tell people all the time, we did actually have this day and age in history where we depended on solar energy and wind energy for all of our power, and it was called the Dark Ages. And
that's a good point.
Yeah, can you put in perspective some of this? The level of subsidization that's out there that really the petroleum industry doesn't get that level of subsidization.
We don't. We get the same tax breaks that any manufacturers get, but nothing special. And we think about, in contrast to, for example, electric vehicles, going back to that, the federal level, there's up to a $7,500 tax credit for buying an EV. So if you buy the kind of car that Washington wants, you get this discount. Well, it sounds great, right? Except for the fact that it's got to be paid for somehow. It's being paid for by the rest of us. And again, it's going to families that on average make well over $100,000 a year. We looked at Massachusetts, for example, which has its own state EV credit. And so a lot of states have these, unfortunately. Colorado's got one for $6,500. Massachusetts had one, I think, for $2,500. Anyway, we looked at Massachusetts. The average recipient of that tax break made over $270,000 a year in household income. Yeah, and you've got...
Well, because the car's still $90,000 after the subsidy.
That's right. And you look at the fact that they're struggling to pay teachers, firefighters, and policemen, and so forth, and here they are paying for these subsidies for essentially toys for the rich.
We had this in Georgia where, I forget, it was an absurd subsidy, and it was like the #1 state to buy an electric car, and they got rid of the subsidy, and it's completely killed the electric car industry.
Yeah, the sales went right off the cliff, and that's never a good sign for a product. When you have an artificial subsidy, it goes away and no one's buying it anymore. And we've seen that in other places too. I think Hong Kong, they had a subsidy for a while, and Tesla was humming along on it, and then they took the subsidy away, and it went down to registrations literally went to zero. Wow. So it shows you how important these subsidies are, unfortunately. And again, we're all paying for it.
It's just somewhat, listening to you talk about that, it reminds me, it's somewhat humorous to me that there are some states now where, for example, Tesla, they can't open their own car dealerships. They have to have special showrooms because you have to have a separate car dealer to do the cars. And you would think that they would look on this and say, this sort of subsidy, maybe we don't need it for us either. And
that's a very big battle, I know, for them at the state level. They have, I guess, franchise laws where they have to go.
Which is just another form of subsidy.
That's right. Yeah, and you know, it would be interesting to see them complain about that, you know, and how they complain about that. And on the other hand, they're receiving all these other subsidies.
So let's step back a little bit more, if you could, and can you give us kind of a broader picture? Because I know the fuel and petroleum industry in the country has changed a whole lot from when I was a kid and my dad was working in the oil industry in Dubai, that it's so much bigger than I think probably, unless you're really from Texas and in it, have any idea what exactly it does.
Yeah, so you know, we represent the oil refiners, and of course, like I said, we've gone from the #1 importer of refined fuels to the #1 exporter in the world, and that's great. So 2/3 now of Mexico's gasoline supply is supplied by the United States. That's pretty amazing, right? And you know, it leads us to an area where maybe we were having a little more trouble recently, which is trade. So trade is very important to our companies because we still do import crude oil, and we export some too as well, but we import a lot of crude oil from Canada. And in fact, that's, when I look at energy security, I say, okay, our #1 importer the #1 source for crude oil is Canada.
We can take them.
Yeah, it's a pretty safe, secure supply, right? And then our #1 export market is Mexico. So I think as we're dealing with these trade policies, we need to recognize that you know, our fuel industry is so strong now, and we want to be energy dominant, like the president talks about, and we're doing that. But we have to be careful not to shut all that down with trade deals that end up hurting us.
You know, what about drilling offshore? I mean, it seems to me that, and I get some of the concerns from we don't want to see an oil platform when we're on the beach and stuff. I personally like to see oil platforms from the beach, but that's just me growing up with it. It seems like we've still got vast reserves of oil left that we could tap in this country from Anwar, which my understanding is they're going to speed up exploration.
Finally improve.
Then offshore reserves as well. We've still got a lot of untapped energy as opposed to the myth that we're all about to run out.
That's right, and that speaks to the importance of infrastructure too. So if you look at what's happening in West Texas right now, the takeaway capacity is really being challenged. It's hard to transport all of it from West Texas down the refineries and the Gulf Coast and elsewhere. So we need to upgrade the pipelines. And you know, it's really counterproductive, even if you look at it from an environmental standpoint. If you're an environmentalist and you're opposing these pipelines, when it's by far the safest and least expensive way to transport these fuels. And so
you mean you're not in favor of trains tipping over carrying oil, which is the environmentalist solution?
Well, yeah, let's build more pipelines, right? And I think a state like Texas understands that, but when you get to you know, TransCanada and other areas, it's still a challenge. And so we're really encouraged by the administration looking at things, looking to speed up NEPA review, for example. It takes over 5 years now to get a project approved under NEPA, which is just amazing, right? The president's talked about this, that we used to be able to build the Empire State Building in the amount of time now that it takes to even start the permitting process. So we need to fix all of those things too, for sure.
I got to pivot here just away from petroleum, and
Sure.
You and I didn't get a chance to speak at a time, but I'm just putting you on the hot spot. Because I forgot that you had worked for Vice President Cheney, and I knew Heritage and Ben Sass, and I mean, it really is just a fascinating career trajectory for you from having been in Texas to getting into the White House, and now where you are and having to suffer through Ben Sass dad jokes for so many years. I mean, what really inspired you to get involved in the process?
That's a great question, and I would say about Senator Sass too is just his Twitter feed is fantastic, but if you're a staffer, you know, it's enough to give you a heart attack every morning looking at that. Yeah, I think
it's not the president's though.
That's true. That's true. I think for me, it was growing up. For whatever reason, I think it was mostly Ronald Reagan, to be honest with you, and he really inspired me to want to serve the country. And so I remember going door to door when I was 11 years old, asking people to vote for George H.W. Bush for president. And because I was convinced that if Michael Dukakis won the world as I knew it was going to end, you know, I might have been right about that, coincidentally. But ever since then, I've just been interested in it. I remember when I was 16 years old, I worked for a true hero, Sam Johnson, who's retiring this year from Congress. I don't know if anyone knows Sam Johnson. He was a Korea and Vietnam vet who was shot down in Vietnam, spent 7 years as a POW. And also one of the most conservative members of Congress, restarted the Republican Study Committee. I got to work for him when I was 16 years old.
Wow.
And so I've just been blessed with great boss after great boss. And I'd certainly put Dick Cheney in that category too, and certainly Ben Sass. So I've just been extraordinarily blessed.
Now, how do you pivot from Congress and think tank world into trade association world?
Yeah, I think for me it's a big pivot. Like I said, because it's a free market organization that I'm with now, that helps a lot. I don't think that's necessarily all that common in the trade association world. It might shock you to know. But to me, just believing in the mission, I guess maybe being from Texas, being around the industry, knowing a little bit, being named Derrick, like an oil Derrick. I guess it was inevitable, right? It's going to end up there eventually. But I'm very, very proud of the work that I do now, and still get to be involved in the process and support the good causes. And like I said, I think this week has been a huge week for American consumers. We got to kind of see it through to the end as well with this proposal, because the administration does have a preferred approach. This is the one we were talking about. It saves $2,000 for a car, it saves 1,000 lives a year. But they also have these alternative proposals. And you can bet that over the next 60 days, the comment period, that the left and a lot of other, maybe even other trade associations are going to weigh in and say, well, you don't need to do quite so much, and maybe you really ought to keep California at the table and all this. But for those of us that love free markets, we want to encourage the president when he does the right thing, and I think he's done the right thing here.
So how's your perception changed? Because I know, not being in the industry, but spending years with my dad working on an oil platform, that I had perceptions that I'm surprised a lot of other people don't have, or they have that I don't. Going into this, you've been there for a year now. I mean, what have you learned that disabuse you of prior notions about the oil industry and refiners?
Yeah, I think just the connections that our companies have with their communities. And quite honestly, I don't think our companies or our association does enough to really explain that. We got a little glimpse of it with Hurricane Harvey, which was a huge tragedy, obviously, still recovering from that down the Gulf Coast. And our companies really stepped up to the plate. Certainly with donations to humanitarian organizations. In a lot of places, the refinery is the biggest and almost only employer in the town, sheltering people on their facilities. Just the way that our companies went above and beyond really made me proud. And we had ride-out crews. So you've got to have people at the refinery to make sure everything's safe, even if you're shut down during these hurricanes, right? So you had people that spent, days and days at the refinery, sleeping there on shifts, making sure that everything was safe for the surrounding community. And they did an outstanding job.
I'm reminded, I guess it was 88 or so, we had come home. I'm from Louisiana, about 30 minutes north of Baton Rouge. We were home for Christmas one year, and I may have been in 8th grade. And I remember my grandmother's windows rattling, and it was the Exxon refinery in Baton Rouge had exploded, devastated that area. And the whole area has changed since then from there, but that refinery is still there, and it is such a part of the being of Baton Rouge and the surrounding area, and the amount of people who work there. When I was a kid, having come home from Dubai back to a rural Louisiana where, the literacy rate was low, the graduation rate was low, and you either went to work for the state or you went to work for Exxon. And the kids who went to work for Exxon wound up, they got scholarships to get college degrees. If they had literacy problems, they did. And then getting older and seeing the malignancy of people who look at these companies as bad, when a number of my friends would not have gotten college degrees but for going to work for Exxon.
Absolutely, and to the safety point too, that's an area where we've improved a lot over the years. And in fact, we found out just this last year, so there's 520 different manufacturers that are ranked about their safety, and refining and petrochemical were number 2 and number 3 for workplace safety and for illness. So we've made real tremendous strides, and it's a fact that people don't really know. And so that's a big incumbent on us to teach them that. But every time you go and visit one of our facilities, you sit, you watch the safety instruction. And more than one of us has gotten our hand slapped for not holding the handrail on the way up the stairs. You'd have 3 points of contact. And it's ingrained everywhere you go. Safety, safety, safety. And that's true at Exxon and so many of our companies.
In the last couple of minutes, come full circle here, because we're talking about the regulation and the deregulation. And I know, as a conservative who was skeptical of the president, not supportive of him coming in, I've just been amazed at the regulatory rollback and the willingness of this administration to roll back regulations. And not just them, even I think Republicans in Congress deserve a lot of credit for rolling back a lot of the Obama administration regulations and doing it in such a way that they can't be reenacted by a future president.
Yeah, that's right. And I think, the old adage of personnel is policy, we can see that, right? I mean, if you've got people like Governor Perry in the cabinet, and you've got Secretary Chow, you've got real conservatives in that cabinet from top to bottom. And that really makes all the difference in a lot of these agencies. And so I think hat's got to be off to them for the way that they're handling the deregulation, for sure.
Well, the fuel standard ones, I mean, from my email stream that I like big vehicles because my wife can't pack light. So
we've got 4 kids. I'm right there with you.
There you go.
We've
yes.
got 4 kids.
Throw in the dog, and you need the big SUV. So
you do.
Derrick Morgan, thank you so much for this.
Pleasure.
I've just enjoyed learning more about the industry itself, but also being able to come in with this breaking news and talk about it. Appreciate it very much.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thank you all.
Thank you.